Right. Roger Dean, living legend. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. So lovely to meet you. I've been a huge fan for many years. So I think it's safe to say that you're basically the father of psychedelic landscapes, or even sci-fi kind of landscapes. Your style is so iconic. It's inspired many over the years and been copied by many over the years. Yeah, I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind maybe just taking us back to the 60s, kind of where you first began your creative journey and how you came to create this iconic style of yours.
Well, basically, what I was doing at the Royal College was essentially architecture.
Hmm.
In the furniture school, I designed a piece of furniture that was called the sea urchin chair, which was the shape of a sea urchin, but when you sat on it, it adjusted to give you proper lumbar support. So it was very comfortable, but it always popped up into this sea urchin shape after you got up. And that was designed in 1966 in its final form. And it was exhibited for the first time in 1967, 3rd of January. So that got a lot of publicity. And apparently it was the inspiration for the beanbags, which were designed and manufactured a few years later.
Right.
Yeah. And at the same time, I was making models of the architecture. I was researching basically the psychology of the built environment. So that
Hmm.
was my focus. And as a consequence of both of those projects, the first job I got on leaving college, I was self-employed from the get-go, was to design the discotheque at Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club. And they wanted a kind of landscape seating. And
Fantastic.
Ronnie Scott being Ronnie Scott, they asked me to do album covers. First one was for a rock band called The Gun, who they managed.
So were you doing I suppose if you're doing a lot of designing, you were constantly drawing at that point, and that's how the album cover designs came to be?
My whole life, I was constantly drawing.
Hmm. So with your designs, and I've looked at some of your architecture and this almost these elements of biomimicry, kind of looking to the natural world and things popping back into the shape and being very atypical of normal architecture for the time, or even now. What were your inspirations around that time? Were you looking at a lot of the natural world, or were you pondering the future?
The shapes came straight out of the research. Basically, I
Mm.
had pretty much no preconceptions about shape, color, texture, anything. I was just trying to find out what kind of spaces made people feel comfortable, secure, happy, and at the same time, what kind of spaces made people feel uncomfortable, anxious, and distressed. And it all came from that. And the curves pretty much were defined by we. I got nowhere with the first year of research until a friend took my questions and asked a bunch of kids in her
Mm.
classroom. And the kids were asked the same questions as the adults were. And they basically were, what kind of spaces would your ideal sleeping space be? I focused on that because that's where people feel their most need of security. And one child described a space that he could physically feel in the dark, there was nothing there, and had an entrance he could physically control and would be on eye level with anybody in his room. So they couldn't loom over him. And that was an interesting thing. And I just copied the shapes.
Mm.
And those shapes seemed to have a big appeal to people. So I stuck with that. And as I extrapolated those responses into the whole of a domestic situation, bathrooms, kitchens, whatever, I was learning that basically what people needed was defendable space. Most of the research threw that up. Defendable space makes people feel good. What is defendable space was interesting. It was not always obvious. A lot of it was counterintuitive. So that was where I was going with that. There was another big element that was aesthetic. So let's say that these weren't figures. These are just me using it for example. But if 70% of the quality was about defendable space, 20 or 30% was about an aesthetic inspiration.
Right.
So the natural world was an inspiration.
Yeah. So when you were younger, did you have bigger pipe dreams of being a grandiose architect and designing large public spaces?
When I was a kid, I got a comic. It was an English comic called The Eagle. And there was a character in it called Dan Dare, Pilot of the Future. And seeing those interpretations of the future were, for me, a big inspiration. I mean, it's a comic, but I thought, wow, that would be something I'd love to do, to design the future. For that future to exist, someone has to design it, or many thousands of people, but it has to be wanted and worked for. It doesn't just happen. So yeah, that was a good inspiration. I was also at the same time very interested in drawing and painting wildlife.
Right. Right. So, I mean, your works are incredibly futuristic. At the time, how were they received by the public once you started your album covers with Yes and things started getting out to the masses? I mean, did these make big waves at the time? Your art was very, like I said, very iconic and very visionary in its true sense.
Yeah, it was, fortunately and thankfully, yeah, we got a very good response. Before I even started working with Yes, I did an album cover for a band called Osibisa. And the important thing for me of that is that several record stores really liked the cover so much, they made a big display of it. I mean, relatively speaking, it was an unknown band. It was their first album. And not only did it make a big impact, that cover, but it got me a poster contract. And we sold a hell of a lot of posters. Yeah, there was a magazine in England that was, I guess, the kind of flagship of the psychedelic movement called Oz. And it was called Oz because its management team was Australian.
Right.
But the art director of Oz was, I think he was either English or South African, but he was called Peter Lederber, and he set up a publishing company of posters called Big O Posters. And one of the first artists in that company was Martin Sharp, who was an Australian artist. So it had a big Australian angle to it. But they did do mine, and we sold huge numbers.
Right.
Took my breath. Had no anticipation that would happen. It meant that by the end of the 70s, and there's no way of knowing accurate figures because computer-driven accountings in those days, sometimes no bloody accounting at all. But it was a reasonable sum to think we'd sold over 100 million units, posters, cards. We even did 60 million phone cards. It was weird stuff, very big numbers. And yeah, it was astonishingly humbling and flattering. I loved it.
I love that your art career really, I mean, you became such an influential artist, but kind of outside of the art world. It came in through another door of the music industry. I mean, was kind of making it in through the galleries ever even? I mean, did you ever even bother with that kind of process, or was it just things kind of unfolded naturally through the music industry?
Um, it's interesting too, because it wasn't just the art world that I wasn't really part of. When we did the publishing company, my first book, Views, we'd sold 80,000, which is quite a big number. We'd sold 80,000 before any went into a bookshop.
Mm,
When they
wow.
started going into a bookshop, which was about 4 months later, it went straight to number one in the Sunday Times bestseller list and was there for quite a while. So, we had weird reviews saying, we've never heard of the author, never heard of the publishing company. Is this a joke? I guess the art world was not paying attention, and that didn't bother me either. I did have exhibitions in galleries, and they were very successful. Two galleries had booked me in. One was the New York Cultural Center at Columbus Circle. I don't even think the building exists anymore. But that was amazing because it was a 2-week exhibition. And so many people came. They extended it and extended it. And I had similar experiences in other exhibitions. And these weren't galleries. These weren't places where the work was for sale, because I didn't want to sell it back then. So these were usually small museums or bigger museums, but they were not commercial galleries.
Mm. As I was mentioning before, kind of coming of age and starting your career in the 60s. I mean, the 60s and 70s, but mainly the 60s just sounds like such an enviable time to be alive, just incredibly explosive for culture, very, just interesting musically and creatively. And it was such a, kind of psychedelic movement in that time. Did living in that time really influence your work? And also likewise, your work seems to have also really influenced the times. What was it like kind of starting out in that time?
You're right. It was very exciting. And there were two very different views of the future at that time. And they were kind of interweaving, but both were exciting. One was that kind of super high-tech version of, the whole of the 60s was technology was about people going to the moon,
Right.
which they did at the end of the 60s. Concorde flying to New York in 3 hours. All that was happening through the 60s. When I was a student, we went down to Bristol to see Concorde being built. So I was very engaged in that technological view of the future. And at the same time, you had that psychedelic age of Aquarius thing coming down the pipe. Both
Right.
were happening and both were there. I mean, many years later, I was at a science fiction convention in Atlanta, DragonCon, and I was very kindly taken to dinner by some engineers from NASA. And they had some friends there who were engineers from the Skunk Works. And they told me that one of my album covers, the Budgie album cover, which had a seagull skull melded to the front end of a Blackbird reconnaissance aircraft. And I made a model of it as well as did a painting of it. And they told me that their big hangar, 600 foot long, had that plane painted all down the side. And I said, oh my God, I'd love to have a photograph of that. And they said, no, not going to happen. We'd be arrested. A camera in there. So yeah, it was, it was interesting going both ways. They told me another story that the chief engineer was a fan, which was very, very lovely to hear. And they said that the profile of the Patriot drone, which they were building a long time ago, 40, 50 years ago, was also based on one of my drawings.
Wow. That must feel weird. Art influencing culture.
Yeah,
I bet.
very weird.
I'd love to ask you about some of the themes in your work. I mean, they're so sci-fi, psychedelic colors. It's fantasy, it's futurism. I mean, there's so many different periods of your work as well, but so many different elements to it. And I was wondering about how what's kind of your process in terms of inspiration? Are you really, is most of your work inspired by the natural world and actually going out to places and extrapolating on them? Or I mean, you strike me as someone who's a dense reader who's quite interested in alternative concepts, and you've got works with pyramids in there. There's floating rocks, almost this kind of these worlds where gravity is elusive. What is the bulk of your inspiration throughout the years?
There's lots of different sources of inspiration,
Mm.
and I don't go anywhere without a sketchbook. If I'm going out to dinner, or even if I'm going to, sitting at a conference or something. I remember we had board meetings when I was working on various projects. I would draw the whole time, and it would worry that I wasn't paying attention. But I paid, it's an aid to concentration.
Right.
Drawing doesn't engage the whole of the brain. If I'm working, I do need a distraction so I can get on with the work. It's an important part of it. So where to go with that? It's
I suppose I mean, another, probably the most obvious thing that I instantly think of when I look at your work is alien worlds. I mean, have you been a bit of have you had an obsession with aliens throughout your life, or the
no, I would say no. It's some of my paintings, even some of the ones that people consider the most fantastical, there's almost nothing fantastical in them. It all could be achieved. Obviously, if I'm painting a dragon, that's a different issue. But there's only a few, half a dozen dragons in 300 or 400 paintings. So most of it's taking things I've seen and rearranging them. I was very lucky because, to the extent that you were saying the 60s was an amazing time, I went to art school in 1961. So for me, I was in the process of training my creative skills, if you like, for the whole of the 60s. But prior to that, my dad being in the army, we spent a lot of time in Hong Kong. And that was amazing. I mean, Hong Kong was intense. In retrospect, I'd have said it was like a 2-year psychedelic trip. It was amazing.
What part of it was so psychedelic or so intense?
Yeah, I mean, it was just fabulous. I loved it. Can't think of a better thing I was 12, 13, 14 while we were there. And it was just incredible. And I spent a lot of time walking around because Hong Kong wasn't built up to the degree it is now. And we could walk across the mountains into what was called the New Territories, and it was pretty much no roads in much of it. So we walked everywhere.
Great.
Most weekends we would be hiking.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
As your work's kind of spanned over many decades, have you felt that there's been any particular narratives that have unfolded as your work has progressed through your work?
Narratives in the paintings?
Right.
Yeah. At the moment, we're talking about doing, and it's not clear whether it's going to be a theatrical or a game or a film, but we are developing a story. We did it last year with a view to it being theatrical, and it was to be performed in the autumn in San Francisco. The organizers, bless them, overestimated what could be done in the very, very little time we had. And at the same time, I was doing 2 exhibitions, and yes, we're on tour. Everything became impossible. So
Right.
we said, okay, let's do this properly, not rush it. And that's where we are now. We're redoing that now. But yeah, for various reasons, I've accumulated a series of stories which keep reappearing in painting. So the narrative is nudged forward, not necessarily continuously, but with big gaps, but still the same narrative over a period of time with a number of paintings.
Mm. And do you think in terms of a body of work or a series of paintings, or do you try to get these narratives or ideas nailed in one work usually?
No. I don't. To be honest, I don't even really think about it. I'm doing other things when I'm painting. So a painting can come about from a variety of things. It could come from a sketch, an idea, a sketch, and it can be fully imagined before I even start, and then I can do it. Or it can be partially imagined, and I start by perhaps just playing, throwing paint around. I can work very loose and let the moment take it somewhere. I can work very precisely. There's lots of different ways, and I experiment it with different ways, with different media. If I'm not playing and I'm not having fun, it's not going to work, so I stop.
Yeah, yeah, good guide to go by. Yeah, I was
Yeah,
curious about your approach because I mean, so many of your rock formations and mountainscapes they're quite abstract. I mean, like the huge loop kind of forms that are these big rocky arches. I mean, I could imagine you just sitting there, just kind of being really playful in the initial stages of those, and then tightening them into actual forms with weight behind them. But were those works very intuitive to begin with?
well, you say those work, but that covers a multitude of
Right.
different approaches. Yeah, there is some where I just love the energy of something that's done in a couple of seconds,
Mm,
far less a couple of minutes, and
right.
wow, you can do that 10 times and 10 of those are rubbish. Do it
Mm,
100 times, one might work. So I love doing that. And if one of them gets my imagination, I then, okay, the energy bit's done. Now let's make it real. So, or
mm,
let's nail it down. So I might then put in light falling on this hugely energetic shape very carefully, like putting tiles on it or something. And, knock out the background, put a sky in. So, yeah, I like that. I like working that way. But it's other times it's been a question of having a sketch and thinking, right, I'm going to make that work.
mm.
And then drawing it up and painting it.
How about the natural world? Are there any particular countries or landscapes that you've been drawn to, or that travel has really brought out the creative juices out of you?
Many.
Mm,
Um, let's start with Hong Kong. Hong Kong is not a particularly lush climate. It's very dry, even though the air is humid. It's much like the Malibu Mountains in Los Angeles. I was really surprised when I was there how similar it was. That kind of sandstone, chaparral, no real forest, just bushes. It was reminded me of Hong Kong a lot.
mm,
But what I also saw in Hong Kong was the, 2,000-3,000 year old reproductions of 2,000 or 3,000 year old watercolor landscapes of mountains and pine trees and waterfalls. And that did inspire me and impress me a great deal. So that was not so much that real landscape, but the art of that landscape. When I started getting inspired by landscape, I guess it was Scotland first. We used to climb in Wales and Scotland when I was a student, every holiday we could. And that was fantastic. And then America, the deserts of America. So a lot of those arches in America did appear. Bryce Canyon has appeared in several of my paintings.
Right.
Familiar cliffs, and yeah, they have been very inspirational.
Yeah, I've definitely picked up some Bryce Canyon vibes and Arches National Park. I mean, the natural landscapes of North America are just mind blowing. I did it a few years ago and just been a huge source of inspiration for myself. Yeah, it's funny you mentioning Hong Kong. You know, I spent a year in Japan, and I saw a lot of woodblock prints, and a lot of them really reminded me of your works. These beautiful sepia skies and things, and even a lot of your floating mountains really reminded me of very calming, beautiful Zen gardens, or what do you call those, bonsai trees and things like that. So yeah, a lot of Asian influence now that I kind of think about it. Well, interpretation at least.
Oh, influence is a good word. It works. Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, we were looking at bonsais in Hong Kong. I mean, the Chinese had them too. They didn't call them bonsai, but they had miniature gardens, and you could buy little figures and bridges and pagodas to go in these bonsai gardens. The Japanese ones are more aesthetically austere. They don't go in for figures so much. And I love the Japanese ones. So but it was, yeah, the experience of them as a living miniature was fantastic. Also had the other side of that coin. The first bonsai that I read that the first bonsai were actually birch, mountain birch, that naturally grew very, very small, typically 3 or 4 foot for a 50-year-old tree. And in Scotland, you have some of that. In the very north of Scotland, there are silver birch that are clearly very mature trees and very small. They're not, pot size, but they're, something you could encompass as a human scale. Yeah, they were beautiful. And of course, they're also in a mossy landscape. So you get that other miniaturized view. And there's a place in Scotland, Sullivan, fantastic mountain range. Stack Polly, I'm trying to remember all the mountains because we climbed and walked all around there. And it's full of miniature landscapes. You look across it and you see thousands of lakes, but all of them are tiny, They're not puddles. You don't want to step in one thinking it's a puddle. Right. They might be only 20 or 30 feet across, or maybe 50 feet, but they're small. It's all miniature. And you'll see miniature islands in them with miniature trees. So it's fantastic.
I'm wondering whether you could expand on some of just one or two of your works of kind of my favorite pieces. One of your works are so colorful, but sometimes you also use a very limited palette. The work Relayer seemed to be quite an interesting, different direction at the time of that work. A really limited palette, very architectural. What were some of the ideas behind that piece?
It came out of a sketch in my sketchbook when I was a student. So it had quite a long gestation period. It was, and it was also very much about being in Canterbury Cathedral and seeing the fabulous geometry, that incredible intuitive engineering that the Gothic cathedrals have, and just wondering if they moved even more independently of the restraints. I mean, the Masons who built those were unbelievably talented. The quote from the Masons who built the very first Gothic cathedral, which is in Paris, Saint-Denis, and it was an Abbot Sugar who commissioned them. And they said that we were building something so audacious, men will think we're mad. And I love that. I love that motivation to do that, because they were invented. They didn't evolve from church architecture. Church architecture tended to be very monastic and cave-like, really. And then this abbot saw stained glass, and he wanted to build a palace of light. So the inspiration for these things and the invention of them, and then the unbelievably skilled engineering that got them built, it's pretty much never been matched anywhere in the world or any time. You know, in terms of scale and weight of material, the pyramids take a lot of beating, but they don't have that fantastic scale and lightness and skill in the mathematics.
The pyramids have also made many appearances in your work throughout the years. Pondering.
Not...
Okay, sure, right. I mean, there was the Asia pyramid. I think was probably the most prominent one. Has that been a source of pondering of how they were built and everything for you, as the mystery of the pyramids?
I think it's simpler than we think. We tend to very clever but simple. I mean, for example, people have been wondering about how amazingly precise the baseline is on a pyramid. How on earth did they manage to get it so it's accurate to a thousandth of an inch, that horizontal that it's built on? And the answer is clever but simple. A little trench with water in it. So at both ends, they know exactly the height of the water, and it's the same. So the water made the level, and it is absolutely precise. In a way, it's a leap of imagination, but it is very, very simple.
Makes sense.
And the building of them is simple too. Huge amount of labor. I don't believe it was built by slave labor. I think it was built by people who were inspired and excited to be involved in it. But it was physically hard work, but it was not impossibly hard work.
Right. Yeah. I'm not sure if this is something that you don't mind going into at all, but I was wondering about the Avatar saga that went down. I recently had a look back at just some snapshots from the film Avatar, and I heard that there was some possible plagiarism issues, but now that I've really gone back and looked, there is the whole world seems to be modeled off your creative practice. I mean, how did that feel?
Well, it felt two things. One reaction was very negative. I thought, my God, they've plundered my life's work for this. And the other was, my God, my work looks fantastic on the big screen.
I mean, it looked great, I have to say. I'm not sure if you want to hear that, but yeah, it was an incredibly beautifully visual film. But...
Well, we set about suing, and we had a judge who ruled that he saw no similarities, but he jumped through a few hoops to get to that position. And we had one copyright academic immediately write saying the judge got it wrong. Yeah, I yeah, I think that's right. The judge got it wrong. But we just had no more resources to go on. And my lawyer said I might need to find some sum, and I forget why it was, but it was about $1.5 million
Mm.
in 30 days if I wanted to pursue this. And there was
Wow.
just no way to find that at that time. So nowadays it would be different. There's ways, and I know more about doing that. But yeah, did they copy? The answer, in my view, is of course they did.
Yeah, I think it's undeniable. I mean, the more I was looking at it, I mean, even the dragons that they fly have that the pattern work in the wings seems to be pattern work that you've done. The huge arches that are also covered with kind of moss. You've got floating rocks. You've got waterfalls coming down. I mean, I found it really. It just seems like it all came down to one judge, didn't it?
Well, let me explain that. It's too boring to go into too much detail, but
Mm,
I'll give you it in a nutshell. They didn't defend themselves on the basis of saying we didn't copy. They
mm,
didn't admit copying either. I have to make that clear. Their position was essentially we didn't copy, but even if we did, we only copied things that in law we're entitled to copy, i.e., things you yourself have copied from nature. That was their position. Now, what the judge did is interesting. He summarized the basic copyright law, which says if an ordinary person can see a substantial similarity, then it's a copy.
mm.
So we had 3 million people who saw a substantial similarity. And, there was no way that could have been their defense that they didn't copy. They, 3 million people saying a substantial similarity. Then you had the issue about it being they only copied things they copied from nature required a lot of me showing 6 or 7 points they copied faithfully that I didn't copy from nature. I changed. Now the judge on that first thing said the works taken as a whole, if an ordinary person can see a substantial similarity, it didn't allow for explanation or detail. So he dismissed some of my evidence on the basis that it was explanation and detail, because that is not how you do a normal copyright thing. You have to do the works taken as a whole. But as I said, this wasn't a normal copyright defense. Their defense was that they only copied things that I copied from nature. And all my detail and explanation was to show how they copied things that I changed from nature.
Mm.
So I think it was a flawed ruling.
Mm.
He's a
I
federal
mean,
judge.
yeah, like I said, I mean, the film, I'm sure you don't love hearing this, but the film looks fantastic. And it's just such a shame that a film that I think they grossed almost like 3 billion, like in the billions. It's just such a shame that they didn't actually include one of the main sources of inspiration in that, whether it's consulting or yeah, I don't know, crediting you or however that comes. So yeah, it's a real shame that the judge didn't see the correlation.
Production designer himself acknowledged that he studied my work and referenced it in the making of the film. And he made a comment like, floating mountains, where else would you go? It was...
Yeah. You had an exhibition last year, I saw. I think it was at the Chambers Project. Is that correct?
Last year was a good, busy year. I had 4.
Oh, 4.
Yeah.
Wow, fantastic. Yeah, you haven't slowed down at all. Hey, I mean, I've also seen that you're still working with Yes and still making album covers for them. Is that also correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, fantastic. How did your show go? How was that?
Well, let me tell you which they were. Michael Pierce curated a show called Other Worlds, and he had a couple of mine in, but it was multiple artists. Then my daughter and I did a show at Haight Street Arts Centre.
I saw her work. It's beautiful.
Yeah. And then we both a show at the Chambers Project in Grass Valley, which was enormous fun. I love that place. And at the same time, we had a relatively permanent show at Trading Boundaries in mid-Sussex in England. So, yeah, it was a busy year. In addition, we had a traveling show with Yes. So, yeah.
Oh, wow. How does a traveling show work? Does that basically an exhibition that goes along with their tour?
Yeah, yeah.
Fantastic.
So it's a few hours before the show. It's packed up by the end of the show, so you can't hang around afterwards and see it. But yeah, it's good fun. Unfortunately, because of the chaos of the time, I wasn't with them. But this summer, starting at the end of September, I'm going to be with them on tour.
Fantastic. Are you considered part of Yes? Are you part of the band? Is that official? No. Right.
I'm honored to work with them, but I'm not part of the band.
Yeah. How has it been being so linked to the music industry? I mean, being such a important artist of many rock bands and influential rock bands, I mean, you must have had a bit of a taste of what it's like being being a rock star, right? Around that throughout this. I mean, it seems like a really exciting
right.
way to to have an art career.
It has some fantastic advantages. One of the things that when I was starting out, the art world was immensely dismissive of skill.
Yeah, it feels like it's that way now as well sometimes.
Very much so. So craftsmanship was a big issue with the art world. They didn't want to know. And in the commercial art world, it was full of art directors who knew best. And working with bands, I was working with people who were not only immensely talented and creative, but they respected creativity and craftsmanship because they practiced it themselves. So it was a very good world. Excuse me. It's a very good world to work in.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Kombucha.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, I like I said, I checked out your daughter's work. It must be a wonderful thing to see the Roger Dean flame kind of get carried through, and her work is beautifully unique as well. And did you spend much time kind of drawing or painting or teaching your daughter at all, or did she kind of just pick it up on her own accord?
Well, you would think so, wouldn't you? But no, she wouldn't allow it.
Yeah,
she was very happy to teach me, and able to as well, actually, because she did something you don't see a lot of in my work, and that was that she was very interested in anatomy.
Right.
So she would look at my dragon and say, "Dad, that shoulder is in the wrong place. It should be here. And the other one doesn't line up. You need them to be connected." So she'd redraw it and she would be right. So that was good. When she was little, and I mean very little, she would never allow me to say, "Do it like this." It was always, she would sit with me when she was tiny and I'd be working on my desk. She would be sitting on my desk and we'd both be listening to the Fantastic Mr. Fox or something like that on audio. And I'd be drawing and she'd be drawing. So she would be there, but if I had the temerity to suggest a different line on her work, that wasn't allowed. But she did work fine. She, I've got a photograph of her literally aged just over 2, painting the blue background to the painting that's called The Guardians, which was the cover of the Yes reunion album.
Love that piece. Yeah. Beautiful.
So she did the dark blue in the structure. That's still showing. Yeah, she's worked on a lot of mine. I've never worked on any of hers.
Right.
Yeah.
What are you working on at the moment? Have you got much planned for in terms of exhibitions or big projects or anything for the rest of the year?
Yes. Um, as I say, I'm going on the road with Yes in
Mm.
September, in the US. Um, I've got fingers crossed. We're hoping to be building something eventually this year. We're hoping
Mm.
to be able to do something. And that theatrical project is nudging forward. I'm drawing and painting and designing as much as ever, I guess. Yeah.
Fantastic. Is that building project an architectural piece or are you
Yeah.
yeah, fantastic. Wow, great. That sounds really, really exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
really, really excited.
Great. Also, just to finish, I was, like I said, I'm just such a fan, and your career has just been an incredibly inspiring, and I always love seeing art, artists that can actually really make it big and influence the culture. Do you have any career advice for young artists at all?
Well, there is always some advice that always works, and that is develop the craft skills. And whether you want to be a sculptor or a painter or a fabric designer or whatever, it is always a very good thing to draw.
Mm.
Drawing is the core skill you really need to communicate. If I'm designing a building, if I'm starting a painting, a drawing allows me to pass on the information. The basic difference between design and art is that an artist can start with a drawing and finish with a painting and do it all himself. The thing about design is you have to be really good at communicating because someone else executes it. So if you can't communicate, you're going to be disappointed in the results. And drawing is a big part of that communication. So practice, practice, practice. And I'm going to misquote the guitarist. I forget. I won't even mention. But he said
Sure.
he was asked how he got so good, and he said, "Well, I practice all the time." And you can't practice all the time unless you love it. So you have to love what you're doing. And then practicing all the time not only comes easy, it's what you want to be doing. It's like a twitch or a fidget. You just keep doing it. So that's what I would say. Learn the craft skills. Creativity comes from allowing it to arrive. I mean, one of the best lessons I learned in that process, because I've been asked all my life, where do your ideas come from? And I was talking to a guy called Ramesses. He had a band, and I did an album cover for him. I don't know when, 1970, 71, something like that. And we'd been talking, and he had a journalist. I keep repeating this story because it's so illustrative of how it works. And the journalist said to him, Ramesses, where'd you get your ideas? And he said, well, when I'm sitting quietly like this, they come from over here. And we all cracked up laughing. And I knew it was true. That's exactly how it feels. The ideas come largely fully formed. They're not a mathematical, analytical process that may or may not work, but it is not easy and it's not quick. Them just coming and allowing space for them to just come is how it works. And you need to make space for that. When I was once asked by students, and I get asked by students a lot, to give talks. Sometimes they just want me to show pictures, and sometimes they want me to explain how I learned to draw or design or have ideas. And what I would say there is I had an experience in my first term at art school, and I was ill. I had a heavy cold. I went home, and my tutor said, "Don't waste your time, draw this." And he gave me a piece of wood, piece of dead tree. And I took it home, and we normally drew in periods of time that were the same as at school, 45 minutes or 90 minutes. 90 minutes for a double period, 45 minutes for a normal period. And we'd been hardwired to start and finish in that time. And I spent a lot more time on this drawing. Excuse me. I spent probably, first of all, 6-8 hours. I was amazed at what was happening on the paper. And by the time I finished, 14, 16 hours later, it took my breath away. That I'd done that was incredible. And I was listening all the time to what we now call talk radio. There's comedy shows, news, all kinds of stuff, and plays. And the 3 lessons that I learned there was you have to put in the time. Each drawing deserves the time. I do hundreds of sketches that may take seconds, but if you're doing a drawing, you need to put in the time. You need to take your mind out of the equation, because otherwise it'll keep interfering. So if I'm listening to a play on the radio, I can put in an hour and a half, 2 hours, 4, 5 hours without it seeming a strain. I'm just doodling. Taking your mind out of it is important for the creative process as well as the mechanical process. And of course, in the end, you've got something you're not only proud of, but you get a good reaction to. So that's what I said. You know, take the time. That's the key.
Yeah.
And allow space. Take your mind out of the equation. Don't think about what you're doing. Japanese have a wonderful saying about that. If you're learning a martial art like kendo, which is about the sword technique, is that you train the hand so the hand trains the mind. And that's absolutely true of learning to draw or whatever. You train the hand trains the mind. If your hand is training the mind and you are getting out of that zone where you're worrying and thinking, the ideas flow.
Yeah, ideas arriving. I love that. And almost like becoming a finely tuned antenna, you know, ready to receive.
Yeah, that's what you need to do.
Yeah.
And meditation is good. Taking your mind out of it is good. You know, we not only can do 2 things at once, we have to do 2 things or 3 things or 5 things at once.
With when you talk, taking your mind out of it with pure inspiration arriving to you. I mean, do you believe that big, beautiful ideas or inspiration or creativity arriving? Do you think there's some kind of spiritual nature to that? Do you think there's something operating that we are just if you can take your mind out, you can just receive and process?
Well, whether or not it's a spiritual process, it is very similar to spiritual processes. There's a lot in common with the Zen teaching. I wouldn't go as far to say it's a Zen process, but if you are an adept at Zen, you will recognize the process. So for sure, I guess that's my answer, for sure. And it doesn't take, it's not a miserable, austere process. It's a process that's immensely rewarding and fun.
Yeah, love that. Absolutely love that.
Yeah, you have to trust it. Trust the process. It will not let you down.
Yeah. Well, Roger, thank you so much for coming on for a chat. It's been an absolute pleasure meeting you, and your work has given me so much joy over the years. And I know it's given so much of the world, just again, so much inspiration. And it really it really does make it breeds creativity out of people. I think it really gets your mind thinking, and different concepts are always kind of enough information to get you wondering about the future, or aliens, or all sorts of concepts. And for that, I thank you so much, and love the work that you do. So thanks for making the time.
Thanks. And you're going to send me a copy.
Absolutely, of course I will. Thank you very
Perfect.
much, Roger, and thanks everyone for
Thank you.
listening.
Thank
Take
you very
care.
much.